surviving the day. We have our little wren who quite happily feeds around the moth trap when I've emptied it. But how do moths, which are habitually nocturnal, most of them, survive the day? Well, they obviously become masters of camouflage, and we're going to look at some of the techniques they use. One of the common techniques of moths is to imitate dead leaves. So here we've got some typical dead leaf imitators, and some of them are actually really quite fantastic when you look at them. So they're imitating dead leaves. But if you're out in the emerging in the spring and summer, it's better to try and look like a green leaf, isn't it? Because that's what's mostly around. So there are a number of species of moths which mimic green leaves. Now, green is quite an interesting pigment because by and large, green is not a stable pigment. And over time, that green coloring will change and fade to yellow in some species. There are one or two species where the green is fairly constant, but in quite a few species, the green color alters and fades to a straw color. So there are a number of green species, but not that many. But green is obviously a color which is good for hiding amongst live living foliage. In the autumn, of course, we need to start to look at colored leaves, leaves which are turning on the trees. And there are a number of moth species which have beautiful autumn colors, and not just autumn colors, but zigzaggy edges to their wings to look like a sort of drying and dying leaf. So these also, they're mimicking the fact you've now got, say, blackberries out, as well as a dead leaf. You've got some brown colors here, which could be from blackberry staining and so on. Beautiful moths. Another group of moths will imitate twigs. And these are really fantastic because not only do they look like, they've actually bent their wings in a sort of cigar shape to look like a dead twig. And that's fairly clever, but they've also got pale yellow faces to look like where a twig has been broken in half to reveal the center of the twig. And there are a number of species like this. Red swordgrass, for instance. The most famous one, the one we get most in the moth trap, of course, is the buff tip, which looks just like birch bark here, a birch bud here, a broken off birch twig there. It's got everything going for it. And then you've got pale prominent, which is just plain wacky, really, looking like, I don't know what, a bit of dead twig, I suppose, or dead rush or something. Another good imitation is to look like, I don't know, some lichen or something on a tree trunk, or perhaps where a tree trunk has lost a bit of bark and you've got a sort of colored, slightly different color there. So moths like the engrailed here, they hold themselves really closely to the tree trunk, so they just look like a film on top of the tree trunk. And then you've got Merveille du jour, which, if it was on a lichen-colored tree trunk, would really blend in. And even if you go up to the moorlands, where this is on millstone grit, as you can tell from the rock around it, the grey mountain carpet just looks like maybe a bit of lichen or something on the rock face. And what about this, the early two-stripe here? At a distance, you'd have a job to pick that out, because not only does the wing have a sort of feathered edge, so it's not a straight edge, it blends into the background. It's also got these wavy lines, which, if you follow them through, just look like the tree trunk itself. So it's looking like a bit of lichen or something like that on the tree trunk. So it's quite worth, during the day, looking at tree trunks. So you might get some funny looks from people, but if you go around looking at tree trunks, you are likely to find some of these species just resting there during the day. A lot of moths obviously imitate something which most animals probably would ignore, and those are bird droppings. There are a lot of what we call bird dropping imitators amongst the moths, and this is quite a common one. It never sits horizontally, it always sits vertically like this, which is just how a bird dropping would drop and fall onto the wall from a high above. Then you've got this beautiful Chinese character here. That's fantastic. Just looks like a fresh bird dropping. Magpie moth again, another bird dropping, and the rather beautiful peach blossom, which just looks like a dropping from a bird which has been eating blackberries, I suppose, with all the pink in there. And then there's another way they can protect themselves, and this is illustrated quite nicely by this moth called the yellowtail moth, or gold tail, whatever you want to call it. And there is the male and female are white apart from this yellow tail here. Now, in the female, these yellow hairs on the tail are irritant, and once a bird has tried to have a peck at one of these, it won't do it again because the hairs cause a lot of discomfort to the bird. So it's a protective mechanism, if you like. And when the moth lays its eggs, what it does, the female yellowtail, she dabs the hairs from her abdomen over the eggs to give the eggs some protection from predators. And when those caterpillars hatch out, these hairs here are irritating hairs as well. So they're protected in the caterpillar stage. And when that caterpillar spins its cocoon, as you can see it here, it obviously includes all these irritant hairs into the body of the cocoon. So these irritant hairs protect the yellowtail right through its sort of life cycle, if you like. So that's quite an interesting life history. We've then got warning colors. If a moth is really colorful, it usually means it's distasteful. It may be pretty, but to a moth, to a predator, it's got chemicals in its body which are either acidic or poisonous. And this is true of cinnabar moth, magpie here, speckled yellow, burnet moth. We've all seen these species. Those bright colors signify that I'm not nice to eat, and they don't usually bother with it. Okay.
No, I'm not on any pictures.
So here we have what happens if these two species here are obviously mimicking bird droppings. What happens if the predator, say a bird, says, I'm not taken in by that? Well, they open their wings and they flash this bright, gaudy display, and that quite often that's enough to scare the predator or to stun them a little bit to give the moth chance to either fly off or to reinforce the fact that it's really colorful and it's distasteful. So distraction displays are quite common with some species. Again, this eyed hawk moth here just looks like a dead leaf. Similarly, this poplar hawk moth looks like a dead leaf. If you prod them or you peck at them, they open their wings to scare the predator off with this bright display. Okay. And mimicry can go even further than that. because here is the lunar hornet moth, but here is a real hornet. And you can see there's quite a strong resemblance there, isn't there? And no bird is going to attack something like this when it knows that it could well be a hornet or a wasp of some sort. So this, what we call Batesian or Batesian mimicry, is quite common amongst some species of moth, especially the clearwings, and even to the extent that the scales on the wings here of these clearwing species drop off almost immediately. They hatch out of the chrysalis to reveal this clear membrane, just like the clear membrane on the real hornet moth. Fantastic insects, those. What about the larvae? We've talked about adults, and these two species here are two of the commonest larvae which members of the public see. This one, gardeners see every autumn, these great snakes or serpents in their garden. What are they? And of course, they're all elephant hawk moths. And with these elephant hawk moths, they have false eyes here. And what they can do is inflate their head, so those eyes look really quite big and menacing. And in a way that distracts the birds as well. And similarly, the Pus Moth, which a lot of people have seen the larvae, but may never have seen the adult, which is quite a pretty moth. This has got several mechanisms. The first thing it can do is inflate its head to make these eyes look big. It can then emit or throw out these red wisps or out of its tail and wiggle them about. And if that doesn't work, it can squirt formic acid out of its tail as well. So it's got 3 lines of defense, the Pus Moth. So if you're ever out and you see a willow tree, which has got nothing but the actual vein of the leaves left, everything else has been eaten, then it's worth looking for one of these, because they may be in there devouring the tree. Again, we mentioned the cinnabar moth itself being distasteful, but so are the larvae, which are very characteristic. You've probably all seen these, but they're quite toxic, and nothing's going to eat those. So that's a good defense. Similarly, oak egger, you may have seen these larvae, hairy larvae out on the moorlands. This is the adults, which quite often belt around on over the heather. But these are so hairy that very few things will eat them. In fact, the only bird which will eat really oak eggers are cuckoos, interestingly enough. And similarly, we've got an alder moth here, which has got the most wacky larvae, really brightly colored with these little wispy things coming off. Enough to deter any small mammal or bird. And with a lot of the what we call the carpet moths, September thorn in this case, they look just like a piece of twig, and they'll sit there like that for hours and hours, just looking like a dead piece of twig. Okay. So another defense mechanism is used by a large group of moths, which are called leaf miners. What a leaf miner does is lay its eggs, or lay its egg in between the top and bottom layer of the leaf. So it'll lay its egg here, and the larvae will proceed to eat between the upper and lower layer of the leaf. And as it goes along, devouring the contents of the leaf, it leaves a trail. And that trail shape, where it is on the leaf and the species of the leaf, will help you to identify the moth without even seeing the adults in many cases. This is a very common leaf miner on brambles. So if you're ever out and you see a bramble leaf with one of these wiggly lines on it, chances are it's this Microstigmella urella, which actually looks like this, but you rarely see the adult. You mainly see where its caterpillars have been. Another one which we're going to talk about in a little bit of time, most of you may have seen horse chestnuts devastated, the leaves devastated by this horse chestnut leaf miner, which, you know, you can actually hardly see the leaf itself because of the mines on it. But this is the little moth itself, and it's only a couple of millimeters long, so they're very, very small, but you can identify the species of moth without even seeing the adult, just by seeing traces of the leaf miner. But it's a good defense mechanism. Once they're between these two leaves, then nothing's really going to get at them. So it's quite good defense. And then another group actually carry a little case round with them, like this one here, Psyche Caster. They look a little bit like caddisfly larvae, carrying their little case around on their backs, and they'll proceed to eat here, but actually they will retreat into the case. And some cases are made up of twigs like this, and others look like this, and they're so there's a little larvae in there eating away at this plant, but protected by this case. You may have seen this, I don't know. This was a hedgerow not far from Keele. Keele University is just up here. Here's the M6. This whole hedgerow was devastated by, covered in this webbing. And there are a number of species of moths whose larvae live in webs. And this is one of them. This is the orchard ermine. And there's about, I don't know, 5 or 6 species of this, what we call small ermine moths, and they all look pretty much the same and are difficult to identify. But this orchard ermine here, it doesn't seem to affect the hedgerow. The hedgerow will regrow its leaves later. It looks a bit of a mess. But the orchard ermine will feed on various species of tree, whereas some of these ermine moths are specific on certain food plants, and this is one. This is the bird cherry ermine. So if you find a bird cherry in May, I suppose, June, which has got webs on it like this, they'll be the larvae of this adult, which will come out later, sometime in large numbers. So this is the bird cherry ermine. There are 1 or 2 others, the spindle ermine and so on, but they get protection by being in a web. Another group of moths feed underground. They're root feeders, or if you're a farmer, you'll know them as cutworms. And the larvae live on the roots of plants like the wheat crop and so on, barley. So if you get a really bad infestation of moths like a large old underwing, you could wake up one day and find all your crop actually leaned over because they've been eaten by the larvae of these. The roots have been eaten by the larvae of these moths. Turnip moth used to be a real pest species when I first started collecting moths. We were asked to send counts of these moths, these 3, heart and dart, large yellow running and turnip, to the Ministry of Agriculture, so they could actually use the numbers of adults as a prediction of how many larvae there might be the following year. This moth here, the antler moth, used to be a pest on grassland, especially in the north of the country, because its larvae feeds on the roots of grasses. So it's quite a good habitat to be in. If you're underground, you're not going to get many predators. There is a little group of moths which actually whose larvae live underwater, and they live in little bubbles of air just below the water surface amongst the vegetation. Most of them, there's 3 different species here are known as China Moths. I don't know why they're called China Moths. A lot of these names are rather fanciful. But these 3 are quite common in gardens. And then this one here, which is the little water veneer, this one can occur in a moth trap over a couple of days in their hundreds. And they hover around the moth trap or on the ground. And they only live for a very short period of time. They're very short-lived moth, but it can occur in vast numbers in a moth trap on a good evening. But they're aquatic larvae. We ought to mention there are pest species of moths. That's not all good news. And some of the pest species are a real problem, or could be a real problem. Here's one which you may have heard about, the Box Tree Moth. I remember some friends of ours visiting one of the big gardens in France. I don't know whether it was Versailles or somewhere like that, where all the box hedges were alive with these moths, and they would just fly out as you walk past them. Well, they're over here now, and we're getting increasing numbers of box tree moths in our traps in Staffordshire, certainly. Oak processionary is a moth we really don't want over here. They can devastate the oaks. We did have a small infestation of larvae not far from where we live, and the larvae had come in on a ornamental oak tree which has been planted on a village green. The larvae were destroyed by the Ministry of Ag, or whatever they call themselves these days, because it's a notifiable species. And if you live in the south of England, you don't need me to tell you about the problems with brown tail moths. These little moths here, related to the yellowtail we saw earlier, the irritating hairs on them can cause problems for people with asthma or people who suffer with eczema or something like that. And the numbers down in the south of England are so big that these hairs get blown about on the wind and so on, and can cause quite a problem. So it's not all good news for moths. Some of them are real pests. Well, so a look at some of the ways moths, the strategies moths use to survive the day. We'll just have a look at how moths are doing generally. And just in 2021, this publication, which you can get from this URL, or you can just Google it, was brought out, and it's based on the larger moths. We don't have enough information on micros, but so in the country, I don't know whether you probably don't know, there's a survey called the Rothamsted Insect Survey, and the RIS have got moth traps set throughout the country which operate at the same time using the same trap year after year after year, and I think they've done something like 50 years of trapping now. So they've got reproducible data, and that data has been used to look at the state of our moths and how they're doing. And if we look at this map, which I think we saw in part 1, it just shows you the number of species per 10 kilometers square in the UK. And we can see that these pink colors get increasingly more frequent the further south you go, which is probably what you'd expect. Insects are cold-blooded, and the further south, the warmer you are and the more species you get, and areas around Dorset and that are just like mothing heaven, really, people. But here in Staffordshire, we still can average something 300, 400 species of moth in a square. So we do quite well. And the other thing about being in Staffordshire, of course, is that we are in the middle of the country. So we're at the southern end of northern species range. We're at the northern end of southern species ranges. And so we see the effects of any climate change because we start to get moths spreading up here. We might get moths which are disappearing from here and spreading up here. So we can sort of see all that sort of stuff in our area. We're quite well placed for looking at movements and changes in moth numbers. So what are the main highlights of this report? I'm not going to go into all the maps and diagrams, but let's just look at what some of the bullet points. One which you probably don't need me to tell you is that the total number of moths, the biomass of moths, has decreased by 33% over 50 years. And you may remember, if you're as old as I am, going out in your car and having your windscreen covered and in moths flying. And you can go out for, you know, a 200 or 300 mile drive now and not even get a mark on your windscreen. So numbers of flying insects generally, especially moths, have decreased enormously over 50 years. 41% of species have decreased in abundance and only 10% have increased. So that's a worrying trend as well. It's not just the sheer number of moths, it's the number of species have decreased in abundance. Interestingly though, 32% of species have decreased in distribution. That's how far they spread across the country, but 37% have increased. So that means as the climate is getting warmer, moths are spreading. Some species are spreading northwards generally. So there has been a decrease in some, but there's been more of an increase with others. So it's not all the same for all the moths. 51 species, including micros, have become extinct in the UK since 1900, and 137 have become established through climate change or from plant imports. And this is quite interesting. Our biosecurity is lax, to say the least. You've only got to think of some of the diseases of trees and that which have come into this country on imported timber. So that we have got a problem here compared to some other countries which are really strict on biosecurity. The northern range of many moth species has shifted northwards, and they've estimated from the report that it's something like 5 kilometers a year. So we're starting to see in Staffordshire, certainly now, moths which we never used to see before, which have always been common in the south. And we'll look at some of those in a minute. If we look at some of the species which live in the north of the country, and north and west, which is usually fairly cool, as the climate gets warmer, they're retreating northwards, or they're going up to higher altitudes. And this is something which we've also found with some birds as well. Birds like the willow warbler are getting commoner or moving up mountain slopes or hillsides as the climate is getting warmer. They prefer it to be cool and mild, cool and sort of damp, and it's now becoming warm and dry, and it's not suiting some species. The other thing that we've noticed with climate change and early emergence, it's benefiting species that have 2 broods in the year. So some species are able to get 2 broods, whereas normally they would only have had 1 because they've got warmer weather for a longer period of time. Again, this is mirrored in bird species as well, which are able to raise 2 or 3 broods, whereas normally they would only have had 1 or 2 because of the conditions. Just a couple of charts of moths just to show you the numbers which we're losing, if you like. They did a top 30 count of moths to see which ones are declining the most. And Stout Dart here has gone down by 81% and may even be extinct in the UK. But in amongst these moths here are some species which I certainly knew quite commonly when I first started to collect moths 40 years ago. Garden Dart, V Moth, it's gone down 54%. Hardly see any records of these now. Figure of 8 is odd. That it's not that uncommon here, yet nationally it's gone down nearly 50% in number. Dusky lemon sallow has dropped 47% in number, and that is due mainly to the fact that it feeds on elm, and elms have disappeared, so its food plant's gone, and so its fortunes are not good. But dusky thorn, we get quite a few of those here, but nationally it's gone down quite nearly 50%. And these figures are taken over a 10-year period. They're not just annual. So you monitor it over 10 years and then come up with an average. So quite a lot of moths, which you may be familiar with, are actually on the decline. But some moths are increasing. If we look at these, buff footman, some of you may know, has increased by 237%. That's incredible. And you'll notice orange footman, another footman species, and dingy footman equally have increased dramatically. And we'll come on to that in a minute. But other species you'll recognize in here, red-green carpet, species which when I first started mothing were almost unheard of, are now really common. So it's not all bad news. There's quite a lot of moths which are doing very well, thank you. And similarly with distribution, what we're finding is that the cypress carpet, for instance, has increased in range distribution by 273%. So that's something has already been recorded in Staffordshire, a couple of records, and it's obviously going to increase as the years go by. And so we're going to see more and more cypress carpets. Jersey tiger, again, we might stand a chance of getting that. It's increasing really rapidly. Buff footman, as well as increasing in number, 237, is increasing in range. So it's spreading across the country. So some quite interesting figures in there. Scarlet tiger, I'll mention later, is particularly interesting. As far as Staffordshire goes, 33 species of larger moth have not been seen since 1990. So there are a few species which have disappeared from us, as reflected nationally. But we've added 35 macros to the county's total, so that we're actually more than made up for that. And a number of species have either declined dramatically or have increased considerably, and we'll have a look at some of those and why that's so. Blair's shoulder knot first arrived in the UK in 1951, and in Staffordshire the first record was 1980. We've now got 1,186 records of that moth. And why? Because of gardeners. This is a moth which has come in, feeds on cupressus, etc., which we plant in our gardens, and that has enabled it to spread. And if you look at this map here, the red squares note where this moth was seen pre-2000, and since 2000 are the black squares. So you can see it arrived in the county down here, really. This was its stronghold, and it spread northwards across the county, and now is quite a common moth in gardens. Similarly, this lovely little Pyrilid moth, which people have now started to call the mint moth. It feeds on mint and oregano. So normally this moth would be here. This is the limestone of Dovedale in the Manifold Valley, which is where mint and oregano grow in the wild. But because we plant mint and oregano in our gardens, this moth has started to come into our gardens and is now found across the whole county quite commonly. So again, gardeners have influenced some moths that we get in our garden, Light brown apple moth is probably one of our commonest micros these days. It arrived in the UK from Australia in 1936 and was first recorded in Staffordshire in 1999 down here. We've now got over nearly 5,000 records of it. And so all these records here are all post 2000. So this is a real spreader. It's gone like wildfire across the county in a very short, 21 years space of time. Another alien import we've already mentioned tonight, and this is the horse chestnut leaf miner, which arrived in the UK in only 2002. That was the first UK record. And it arrived in Staffordshire in 2005. And now we've got 251 records of it. And it's under recorded because people don't bother to send me records of horse chestnuts now with this sort of this minor damage on it. But they should really, so we can keep tabs on where it is. But you can see in that very short space of time, it's covered the entire county. And I don't think there's probably a horse chestnut tree anywhere in Staffordshire which doesn't have horse chestnut leaf miner on it. It's quite frightening, isn't it, when you think how quickly some of these insects can spread. Another group of insects which we saw mentioned in the table back there, which have spread and have increased in considerably, are the Footman Moths. Now, the Footman Moths actually feed on lichens. So as the environment is cleaned up, lichens have increased on tree trunks, etc., and the Footman Moths have done very well, thank you. And the scarce footman was first recorded in 1977. I know that because it was in my garden in Trent Vale. And we've now got over 1,000 records of it. And you can see here, it's now across the entire county. Similarly, buff footman first arrived 1995. We've now got 484. And nationally, it's increased by 237% in number. So that's done really well. And it's probably down to just cleaner environment, I think. On the other hand, we've lost quite a few moths, and one I've already mentioned, the dusky lemon sallow, feeds on wych elm or English elm, and that tree has disappeared, and similarly so is the moth. And I've only had 10 records since 2000, and the last one was in 2014. But you can see here it was right the way across the county. But these black squares are the only post 2000 records of it. Bit of a dodgy situation to have one food plant, isn't it? If your food plant disappears, you're in a bit of a quandary. Garden tiger, everybody used to know garden tiger years back, and you can see that it would have been recorded right the way across Staffordshire, but there's a lot of empty squares here where it hasn't been seen since 2000. And nobody's quite sure why this is, whether it's to do with milder climate over winter, because moths and butterflies don't like mild winters. They like the frost and a bit of snow to stop them getting sort of diseases and stuff like that. Nobody's quite sure. There's a bit of work going on garden tiger moths, why they're disappearing. On the other hand, spreading now this year, look at this. This is scarlet tiger numbers in Staffordshire, bumping along at 5 here, and then all of a sudden from 2018 right up to here, 2020. I haven't had 2021 records in. This may be a coincidence with COVID and people being forced to spend more time near home, walking locally for their permitted exercise. But a lot of garden tiger records started off down here in the south of the county. They've now spread right the way up here. This is Frog Hall. So it's a moth to look out for, and I hope people will send me records of this over the next few years so we can monitor its spread. So first record 2007, and we've now got nearly 80 records of scarlet tiger. What about extinction? It's very difficult to say whether something's extinct. It's easy to say, oh, that's the first record, because it is the first record. But how do you say when you've had the last record? And it's not easy. And Welsh Clearwing, I thought I'd just mention as a case in point. The Welsh Clearwing in the UK was found on Cannock Chase in the Welsh borderlands here, and there's a little isolated sort of colony up in Scotland. For 90 years, we had no records of Welsh Clearwing on Cannock Chase, so we thought it's extinct, which, you know, is fair enough, isn't it? No record for 90 years. And then one day, a chap who actually was working on this colony here visited some friends who lived near to Cannock Chase, and he walked down to Sherbrooke Valley just for a bit of exercise, and he passed a tree trunk and he saw this, and it's a chrysalis of an emerged Welsh Clearwing in this case on a birch trunk in Cannock Chase on Sherbrooke Valley. No records for 90 years of this moth, remember. So the next year, a group of us went down to Cannock Chase with the lure, the pheromone lure, which is used to attract Welsh Clearwings. And here is the Welsh Clearwing. And they're all over the place. They're all over Cannock Chase. They never did disappear. It's just that we didn't have the mechanism for finding them. Okay. So let's move on. So my monitor's just gone off. Can you still see that?
Yeah, we can still see the slides.
Yeah, my main monitor's just gone off. I can't see you for some reason. So we got a lot. It's not just the rarer moths which are disappearing. It's also some of our common moths, and you can see here this is the large yellow underwing, our commonest big moth, I suppose, and these are the numbers at Keele University over the years, and they've dropped considerably down here, and this is a worrying trend, isn't it? Not quite sure with large yellow underwings why they've dropped off in number. They have subterranean larvae, if you like, and maybe wet summers cause the larvae to sort of drown or something, I don't know, or dry summers cause them to die because they can't feed on the roots, the soil's too hard, I'm not sure, but it's worrying when your common species are disappearing. If you look at this map of Staffordshire, you can see how many species we have in each 10-kilometre square. And you can see that 865 for SJ84, that's around Keele and Trentham. You'd expect that because the two county recorders of Staffordshire used to live certainly in that square. And also it's got some nice woodland around Trentham and so on. Here is Mare, loggerheads and burnt wood and so on. But, you know, that's a fairly average number of, quite a good number of species. This is macros and micros. Until you get to somewhere like here, which is Eutoxeter. Nobody tends to run a moth trap in Eutoxeter, and we're desperate if you live out there for you to do so. So we could expect 700 species here. The fact is we've only got 90, and that's because nobody's looking there. But the areas like this are quite low. So there's still a lot of spaces in Staffordshire to record more species. So what can you do to help, basically? Well, you can record your sightings and send them direct to the county moth recorder. You can Google county moth recorders to find out their contact details, their names and addresses. On the other hand, you can enter them into iRecord, which is the recommended method if you're only doing casual recording. Although Butterfly Conservation prefer people to send all their records to iRecord, and I would support that. iRecord basically is a big warehouse for data to which county recorders have access. And so you don't need to know who your county recorder is. If you put your data into iRecord, I can extract anything to do with Staffordshire from it. And so I get that data. You set up an account quite easily with a username, password, and then when you come to enter, say, a casual record, you've just been out, you've just seen a winter moth on a tree trunk, you ask to put in the date, your name, what the species is, and as you start to type, it auto completes what it thinks is the name you're trying to type in. Are you certain about its identity? Yes or no. Did you record its sex? You don't have to put anything in there. How many have you seen of it, and were they adults? And more importantly, you can add a photo at the same time. That's important, especially if it's I don't know who you are, and if it's a rare species. And then you can put in your location and a grid reference, and you can do that just by zooming in and out on the grid on the map and clicking where you saw that moth or whatever it was you saw, and it will put in the grid reference in that field. And so then it asks you a little bit about habitat, whether it's woodland or grassland or whatever. And here you can put any comments that you might have, and you could submit them, okay, your sightings to iRecord. And if you've got a number of species, you can use a different method, not casual, where you can put in a whole load of species from one particular site. So you don't have to do this for all this for everyone. You can put in all your species names and then say they're all from this place. So it puts in the site details for all the species you entered in that session. Another thing you can do, and I think it's worth doing, especially if you're just starting, is to take part in the garden moth scheme. This moth scheme runs from, I think from March to October, certainly. And it normally asks you to fill in a spreadsheet here on each Friday of the recording period, all the way through here. You can see you can insert a different date if you haven't used the recommended one. And here are all the moth species listed for the common species. And you just put in here the number you've seen. You then put in your details of your name and address, etc., type of trap, and then you send those off to the garden moth scheme. And they produce reports every year, and I also get the people who take part in this to send me copies of their data as well. So the county recorder gets the data from the garden moth scheme. But it's certainly a useful thing for you to take part in when, and there's a website to go with it, etc., etc. A lot of help available there, Facebook group and so on. But be under no illusion, your records are important. And if we want to protect our moths, we need to know what we've got, where they are, and whether they're declining or increasing. And something like 25 million records, your records, my records, were used in this atlas here, which is well worth buying, because it gives you an idea of where the moths are distributed and whether the moth you just recorded in your garden is fairly common or whether it's quite rare. And certainly it's something worth considering. The other thing, mapping scheme we've got are the records from the 4 counties which make up the West Midlands are supplied to butterfly conservation, and those records have been used in this West Midlands Moth Atlas. So again, it all depends on you. These dots are your dots, my dots. And again, you can see if a species you just caught in your square is common or rare. And for each species there are photographs. This is macros and micros. And you can upload your own photographs, if you've got any, to this website. And this was put together by the 4 county recorders, myself, Warwickshire, Worcestershire, Herefordshire and Shropshire recorders built this website. And of course, the main body that looks after butterflies and moths is the butterfly conservation, and I hope Mike might say a bit about that at the end. But they produce these lovely booklets on the butterflies and the moths of the West Midlands. This one includes some guided walks, butterfly walks. You've then got the West Midlands little newsletter, which is I always look forward to receiving, and similarly the national magazine as well. So by joining West Butterfly Conservation, you're not only helping to conserve our Lepidoptera, but you learn quite a lot about the local scene as well. And perhaps Mike will say a little bit in the questions after about how to join and prices and so on and so on. What about something to do now? Not everybody wants to run a moth trap. So you might just be generally interested, but there are things you can do and contribute without a moth trap. And one of them is to go looking on tree trunks now. This winter moth we photographed this morning on the tree trunk in Trentham. So they're out sitting on tree trunks. So you don't need a moth trap for that. Leaf miners. You can go out and find leaf miners or signs of moths throughout the year, but in the winter, that's something you can do. Don't need a moth trap for that. And there are a couple of nice little books here, which Ben Smart has produced. I know it says Lancashire and Cheshire, but you don't need to bother about that. They're pertinent to us as well, telling you how you can look for different times of year, different stages of moths. So leaf miners are quite an interesting field for somebody who doesn't really want to run a moth trap, but can still provide useful information. Again, if you don't want to look at moths with a moth trap, there are 150 odd day flying moths, and this book here is quite good at that, illustrating those. Other useful information, there's at least 3 useful Facebook groups here. There's Staffordshire Moths, Butterflies Conservation, Garden Moth Scheme, all of which you can upload your photographs for identification, etc. There's a lot of websites here which are useful, Twitter feeds, and so on. That's available to you. And Nicola is going to post out to you a handout which I produced listing all this stuff. So don't worry about writing it down together with a list of suitable books, etc. So there's a lot of information out there. These are the books I use quite a lot. These top 3 here, I think, are almost compulsory. This one is really good because it illustrates all the moths, macros and micros, and nearly every species. So there's something like 2,300 species illustrated in this book. Whereas here, you've got to have both. The beauty of these are that they give more information than is available in this book. So you can use the 3 together, and that will see you right. The atlas, of course, we just mentioned, and the moths of the West Midlands. But there are certain groups of moths which can be a bit tricky, even given all these. And there are specialist books for some of those. So the pugs, which are really difficult to identify from photographs. This book does quite a good job, and it says Cheshire, Lancashire and Cumbria, but that applies to us as well. And that's well worth buying if you struggle with these little pug moths. Bird dropping imitating Pyrilid moths, Plume Tortrix moths. Again, this book just deals with those, and so gives you a lot more detail than perhaps you can get from these. Plume Moth specialist book on those, and Caterpillars field guide. And if you're just starting on mothing, there's a guide to moth traps and their use by Reg Fry and Paul Waring, how to build them, where to place them, what types of moth traps are available. And they're all available from places like Amazon and etc. So just to finish off with, to give you a little bit of hope of finding something interesting, these 2 moths caught in Staffordshire over the last 18 months are new to the British Isles. They're UK firsts, and they were caught in Staffordshire, in North Staffordshire, no less. One of them by an ordinary member of the public, one of them by a casual mother. But it just shows you what you can find. This one here was found by a chap in Newcastle who was just weeding his garden. And this was there. He took a quick photograph with his phone, I think. It turns out to be the Azalea rough bollworm. And interestingly, this moth was disturbed from vegetation beneath an azalea bush. And this azalea bush had just been brought from a nearby nursery a few weeks earlier. And it appears that, I didn't realize this, you may not know, Italy is a big exporter, importer of azaleas. And the azaleas at this nursery have just been imported from Italy, where this moth has arrived from Japan. So it's biosecurity out the window. This moth is now in the country, and we had to notify people about it because it could be a possible pest on azaleas in the same way as the box moth is on box. But there you are. It's a chance sighting of a moth in Newcastle, which was new to the UK. Similarly, this one here was just added this year to the UK list. And this one, I couldn't make it up, was found by a member of the public at Abbey Hulton, which is north of the Potteries, as he was emptying or looking at a terrarium, sort of converted fish tank, which he used to keep poison dart frogs in. And to keep these poison dart frogs, what he's been doing is getting and gathering leaf litter from nearby woodland to put in the bottom of the terrarium, which is where a lot of these poison dart frogs, I gather, live, in the leaf litter layer. And he saw this moth on the edge of his tank. He had the presence of mind to take a photograph of it. And I didn't recognize it. It was recognized suggested by someone else what it was. And it turns out to be new for the British Isles. So there you go. there's hope for us all. You don't need a moth trap to find something interesting. It could be a new species for Staffordshire, which is quite likely. It's quite nice to get a first for Staffordshire, and it's not unusual to do that. But to get a first for the United Kingdom is something else. It's not often anybody gets to do that. Sadly, I never saw either of these because of COVID. I was not able to get round to look at the individuals. I've just got the photographs to go on, but I have written them both up, and so they're now firmly down on the British list. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Can I see you? I don't know. I've lost my... Can you see me at all?
Yeah, we can still see you. Yeah.
Okay.
So you might just have to listen.
Yeah, I can. It's all right. My monitor. I've got two monitors here. One which has been using for the talk, and the other one which is connected to you all. And it's that one which is just timed out. It's a damn thing. I can see you all now. Hooray! Good.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Dave. We have run over a little bit, but that was so
Sorry
interesting that I just let you carry on. It was such an interesting talk. So thank you so much for giving that to us. So I think what we'll do is we'll dive straight into any questions we've got, and we'll finish up at 8:30 still. So so there is one in the chat. So if you've got any questions that you want to put in the chat box, then please pop them in, or you can unmute yourself, stick your hand up, wave at me, and ask them in person. So we have got one in the chat box. Is there a danger of duplicate counting if reported to several different schemes?
Yes, basically. There is always that difficulty, but of course, if I import stuff from iRecord and I also get the same data sent to me by separately, then I can match the records up and see if they're duplicated, but my software doesn't tell me that automatically. So yes, there is a danger of that. So I try and persuade people, if they're sending stuff to iRecord, don't send it to me separately. Or if you're sending stuff to iNaturalist, which is the other recording scheme, again, just do that. Don't do it to both. Otherwise, there is a danger. But I don't think it's going to make that much of a problem. It won't alter distribution, that's for certain. But it might, I suppose, alter numbers a little bit. But I should be able to pick that up. In the software I use, it'll just give me a list of duplicates. I just have to sort that out.
Is it better to have the same records twice or not at all?
Oh, I'd rather have them twice. What I would say, which is really important, if you're not sure about the identity, it's better not to record it, because no record is better than a wrong record. So if you've got something, you're not sure what it is, it's too worn, let it go. Don't fuss about it. Don't try and make it into something which could be wrong, and then send it to me. It's just going to, that's a real problem. I'd rather not have any record than a wrong one.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So there's no other questions I can see in the chat at the moment. Did anybody want to unmute themselves and ask anything at this point?
I would say, if you are recording, to send me your records now for 2021. We need to start getting those together. I normally get, just might be interested to know, you normally get around 30,000 records a year. So it's a lot of information there, and that all goes back to butterfly conservation and also to the local record centre, which is hosted at Wolsey Bridge. with the Staffordshire Ecological Record. So that data is always around, and of course you can see the results of all that data by going on to our West Midlands Moths website and looking at the atlases there, so you can see how well you've been doing and how important your record is compared with others, and why you're not getting this species. You may find that it's not in our area, but you can only tell that by looking at the atlases. So that's one reason for getting that big atlas, which yeah, it's quite, I don't know, it's not that expensive considering the amount of data in it, but it just shows you how your data fits in with the national picture. And I don't know, is Mike there? Mike, do you want to say anything about butterfly conservation?
Yeah, I mean, on recording, I think that it's far better to have a go at recording than not to have a go, in the first place. Obviously, some moths are difficult to identify. I think the beauty of using iRecord is that those records are actually verified. They're actually seen by Dave, and obviously Dave has got a good understanding of what moths are actually found in Staffordshire. And also, some of the sort of ID tips and so on that might actually help to distinguish species. So I think it's worth having a go. Dave is obviously right. If the moth is very, very worn, then you've probably got not much hope. But I think that it is definitely worth having a go at recording moths. And as I say, there's this check in all the moths actually go in front of the county recorder, and he has to verify them before they then become accepted as being sort of accurate records and used in reports and so on. So I think that that's good. I'm also a big fan, for those people who haven't actually done much in the way of mothing, of doing the garden moth scheme. As Dave mentioned, it actually runs. You can do it during the winter, but I wouldn't particularly recommend that because you're not going to find that many moths. But the advantage of the garden moth schemes, it actually starts at the beginning of March and runs through to the end of October. So it does give you a kind of easy way of actually getting into moths, because obviously in March there are not that many species actually around. You might only catch a dozen or so moths in your moth trap during the month. So you've got plenty of time to actually look at books and work out exactly what they are and get experience before you're actually faced with perhaps a multitude of moths come the summer months in sort of July and into August. It's also, I think, good for beginners in that you only are expected to record once a week. And for those of us that perhaps live in sort of towns and so on, where we might have sort of neighbours that might get a bit sort of jumpy if we're putting on lights in our garden every night of the week, just to do it once a week, I think is actually something that's fairly sort of acceptable to most people. And that data is really very, very useful because it does reach a county recorder, it does reach eventually butterfly conservation nationally, and it does give us a feel of actually what's happening really with moths. I always say to people, I think that the Midlands is a great place to live as far as moths are concerned, because we're actually on the edge of range of a number of sort of species, particularly the ones that Dave has mentioned that are primarily sort of southern species. What we're actually finding is that they're heading northward, so they're coming our way. So it's always very exciting, I think, to open your moth trap in your garden and actually find what you have. I don't think we might be as lucky as some people have been in actually having species that are new to the UK, but certainly there's a good chance that you could actually pick up a species that might be actually new to the county, or a species which is actually becoming commoner and commoner. And although the moths are obviously in decline, and certainly in terms of abundance, it's quite interesting when we published our Moths of of the West Midlands book, we were a bit surprised, actually, looking at moths since the year 2000, to find that although there were 35 species that hadn't been recorded, which had been previously recorded in the last century, we'd actually had another 55 species that were actually new to the region. And so, you know, recording and monitoring moths is really an important thing to do.
Thanks, Mike. I think the other thing is, if you're going to take photographs, try and take a number, because quite often it depends on the angle at which you've taken the picture. Does it show the right features? So, you know, take a few pictures of a moth. It's cheap. You don't have to buy film these days, and that helps me a great deal.
Fantastic, thank you, and thanks, Mike, for that as well. It's really interesting. There was a question linked to that. Is it worth moth trapping at this time of year?
It's always worth moth trapping any time of the year. Was it 2 nights ago, I had 7 December moths outside the trap. It's so mild at the moment. I'm not going to get December moths in March when the garden moth scheme starts. So yes is my answer. If you get a good night and you think, oh, it's quite mild, it's worth putting the trap out. You may get nothing, but you might get something which only flies at this time of year and is going to be missed otherwise. So yeah, get out there. My trap's on now.
Brilliant. And Roger's just popped in there as well. Paul Batty supplies components if you wish to build your own.